Greetings to everyone, whether here in Milwaukee or elsewhere. My name's Joseph Kearney, and it's a great privilege for me as Dean of Marquette University Law School to introduce our conference, Policing and Accountability, a Community Conversation. This is a program presented by Marquette Law School's Lubar Center. That's a term with a couple of different meanings. As some of you know, in one meaning, the Lubar Center is a grand room here in the law school's home, Eckstein Hall. It's the place on the first floor where, outside of COVID times, the community often gathers, whether it's for releases of the Marquette Law School poll, debates among candidates for office, distinguished law lectures, or on the issues with Mike Gousha conversations. But the term is also a shorthand for our Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. We have found it particularly important to keep our Lubar Center programs going online during these socially distant times. This conference, Policing and Accountability, a Community Conversation, has two sessions. Before I mention them more specifically, I want to introduce my colleague, William Welburn, Vice President for Inclusive Excellence here at Marquette University. Dr. Welburn is not only a longtime collaborator and supporter of our law school generally, but also helps lead the university's annual Marquette Forum. Today's conference is a joint offering of our Lubar Center and the Marquette Forum, and I've asked Dr. Welburn to give us a sense of this year's forum. Dr. Welburn.
Yes, thank you, Dean Kearney. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to support the efforts that you are making in the Marquette Law School and in particular the Lubar Center in making the issues around us very, very meaningful, giving us the chance to really dive deep into those meetings, which is what I believe this conference is about. It's very exciting that you all are taking on issues that are very difficult. The role of policing in the community is especially difficult, and I applaud your efforts not to back away from that. I believe this is an issue that's going to be of real importance and real attraction to not only to our campus, but to our community, to Southeast Wisconsin and beyond. The Marquette Forum was started about 5 years ago with the idea that we would not shy away from difficult issues. And each year we've taken on a theme to unite our campus and community in public discussion. This year, of course, the theme is acknowledging and healing racial injustice. And I can think of no more important issue than the one that the Lubar Center is addressing during this conference than the relationship between police and communities. So I applaud you for these efforts, and I'm happy to be a supporter through the Marquette Forum.
Thank you. We're really appreciative of your longtime partnership. The conference's first session is going to be led by my colleague, Mike Gousha, Distinguished Fellow in Law and Public Policy, and it will present perspectives of the community beyond the legal profession per se on policing and accountability. Mr. Gousha will introduce the panelists with whom he will be speaking. Then our second session will be led by the Honorable Steve Biskupik, a Milwaukee area lawyer with Biskupik and Jacobs. He's also the former United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin and an adjunct professor here at Marquette Law School. He too will introduce the members of his panel, which draws on the legal community more specifically. You will not see Dr. Welburn or me again on screen at this conference, but on behalf of all of us at Marquette University, we certainly want to express our gratitude to those who are engaged in the conversation today and to each of you for your interest and engagement in this important set of topics. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dean Kearney and Vice President Welburn, for that welcome. Today, we're going to be exploring two key questions. The first is what can be done to improve relations between law enforcement and the community? And the second is what does the law tell us about deadly force incidents involving law enforcement and how they're investigated and charged? We're going to begin this conference today by talking about the relationship between police and the community. And joining us to have that conversation are four individuals. Let me briefly introduce them to you. Amanda Avalos is the newest member of the Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission. She has held a number of community organizing positions in the city, and she is currently Senior Civic Engagement Director for the community organization Leaders Igniting Transformation. Nate Hamilton is the chair of the Community Collaborative Commission. His brother Dante was shot and killed by police in April of 2014. Nate Hamilton has led both protests and efforts to improve the relationship between police and the community. Ernell Lucas is the Milwaukee County Sheriff. Prior to that, he was the top security official for Major League Baseball. He's also a 25-year veteran of the Milwaukee Police Department. And Jeffrey Norman is the City of Milwaukee interim or acting police chief. He has been named to that position late in the year and has been serving in that role since. Chief Norman has spent nearly a quarter of a century with the Milwaukee Police Department, and he also, we're proud to say, has a law degree from Marquette University Law School. Again, thanks to the four of you for being with us today. And let me begin by talking about where we are today. A lot has happened in the last year. The George Floyd death began a really tumultuous summer in America. We have seen mass protests in response to incidents involving deadly force by police. We have seen calls for reform and greater accountability on the part of police. So I want to begin by asking each of you to briefly describe to us how you think that relationship is today, the relationship between police and community, law enforcement and community. How would you describe it today? And I'll begin with Amanda Avalos.
Thanks, Mike. It's a loaded question. I think you kind of touched on this, but the past year we've seen a life that we couldn't even predict. And that's on every front, right? I think the relationship leading up to where we were this time last year was torn. There were a lot of folks were feeling outspoken about everything that was going on here locally, in the state, even federally. But I'd say this past year, the energy is up. The momentum is here. Folks are feeling like, this is it. There are too many things that we are just letting go or letting happen, I would say, especially in like a local police law enforcement level. I would say the relationship is torn. There's a lot of folks are feeling very energized about their opinions, their beliefs, what they're seeing. Folks are feeling desperate, and that's, because of many different factors, whether it's, the pandemic having an effect on your employment or your housing or your health, your family, your ability to take care of yourself. And then, the factors of, not feeling safe in your neighborhoods or your communities and being profiled. There's a lot of things that are stacking up, and folks are feeling weighed down. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of like where we're going, but there's also a lot of like hope and energy in the way that we are making progress in baby steps. So I'm feeling hopeful.
Nate Hamilton, how would you describe the current state of the relationship between law enforcement and the community?
Within the last year, I feel it got more tense after George Floyd, Joe Avocito, and the things that happened in Wauwatosa even affects what's going on here in Milwaukee as well. So it's been very tense, very strained on my behalf, and what I'm trying to do with the chair is kind of help move that relationship to a better place. It's a lot better than what it has been, but I think what hinders it is the lack of accountability. So we're looking at like, how can we get more accountability? How can we get not only a community, but a police department to share equal level of respect towards one another, and also understanding one another's our job, our job as community members and the job of law enforcement and what they're entailed to do and how they're entailed to, how they are supposed to treat community members. And we're looking at this SOP and and Jeff Norman, can talk more about it too, but, community-oriented policing and just being more involved in building a community up through law enforcement instead of always seem like law enforcement is tearing down communities. So, we're looking at different avenues and different ways to approach, law enforcement and community to get a better understanding of one another so we can have and share a level of great respect for each other.
Let's get the law enforcement perspective on this, and I'll begin with Sheriff Lucas. Sheriff, what's your take on where we are right now in that relationship between community and law enforcement, and what impact did the George Floyd death and other deadly police incidents have on your department's ability to carry out its role?
Well, thank you for the question, Mike, and I'm very appreciative of being on this call with your other guests. Let me say that right now, I see our relationship with the community as being one of the more challenging periods in my over 4 decades in law enforcement. As we come through the history of the Rodney King incident out in LA about 30 years ago, and certainly the Simpson verdicts of the 90s, and the relationship between the police community right here in Milwaukee, it's been a continual evolution. And I'm pleased to hear Brother Nate say that it's improved, it's gotten better, but we still have a long way to go. We have a lot of work to do. What we witnessed back on May 25th was one of the more reprehensible acts of man's inhumanity to man, in the acts of 4 former Minneapolis police officers taking the life of one Mr. George Floyd. And for hundreds of days, communities all across America cried out that we want reform, we want change in our police. And I stood on the corner of King and Locust in a neighborhood that I grew up in on the morning of May 30th after the first incident of protest here in Milwaukee and said, we hear you. It's time for all of us now to come to the table and have that discussion. We need to have that substantive discussion, Mike, but it's going to involve everybody at the table. I'm glad to see Ms. Avalos join the commission and the work that she does in the community and bringing that to the commission. Certainly, Mr. Hamilton has done a lot of work in this community over the years. But it's important that every aspect of our community, the business community, philanthropic community, the faith-based community, the community at large, and the police, all at the table having this discussion about police and community relations.
Chief Norman, I'll give you a chance to respond to this too. Give me your assessment of that all-important relationship, community, police.
It's extremely important, Mike. Looking at it from the standpoint of what happened in 2020 and that lack of trust, that lack of connection, really emphasizes that we have a lot of work to do. The George Floyd situation was a watershed moment for law enforcement, but as a community as a whole, the nation, reflecting in regards to what does that look like for our leadership and also our officers dealing with our most important responsibility, which is our community. Part of my 4 tenets that came in as the acting chief, one is accountability. I heard that being discussed in this particular program. We have to be accountable as a law enforcement agency to have the legitimacy in our community. It's important for the public to see us being responsible in regards to our own acts so that we have the ability to show credibility in regards to enforcing the laws of this city, the state, and also the country. So for me, it is really about relationship building. And I say that real emphasis because I think a lot of times we get into these catchphrases, collaborations and, want to get together. And we have to have a genuineness behind that. And our acts and deeds must line up. We just can't use it as a word of the day. There has to be true effort and momentum behind that. And it starts with leadership. Accountability starts with leadership. I said that to the entire department and I shared it with many individuals, Fire Police Commission, our city leaders, in regards to accountability starts with me. If I can be held accountable, everyone under me from assistant chief, inspectors, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, officers, and police aides will be held accountable. And that really resonated with the officers because too often as we see across the nation, we're always going after officers, but there's someone behind that in regards to allowing behaviors to take place or not paying attention in regards to behaviors taking place. So accountability is a department-wide standard that needs to be held from the highest to the ones who are, the boots in the street, which will help in regards to building trust with our, community, with our city leaders and other law enforcement. So definitely we have a lot of work to do, but I hear it in this call, especially hearing it from Brother Hamilton and Commissioner Avalos, even, Sheriff Lucas. We're hopeful. There's optimism. 2021 has a lot of potential if we have the right behaviors and the right people in place to make this happen.
Let me, we've heard the word accountability come up several times already in this conversation. So let me go to Nate Hamilton. Nate Hamilton, help me understand what you mean by accountability. What does that mean to you in terms of the way police and law enforcement would go about their responsibilities? To Nate Hamilton.
Sorry, first and foremost, looking at accountability, it's been hard to witness that in this city and most cities across this country. And I think it's completely due to the fact that when we look at independent investigations into, these occurrences, we find it, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we see it. Mm-hmm.
We look at it as being kind of hard to trust our district attorney right now, which is John Chisholm, to pass a great judgment when he works so closely with Milwaukee Police Department. We look at it to be so hard for next door neighbor police departments to investigate these occurrences as well, when a relationship has to be forged in order for the borders to be protected when it comes to law enforcement. So, I would like to see eventually some true independence when it comes to investigating law enforcement to create a level of accountability. So maybe that's, a private prosecutor who looks over law enforcement cases. And I know we used to do a lot of work with DCI and they would provide investigators, but within my brother's case, 3 of those officers were ex-Milwaukee police officers. So it didn't look completely independent to us. So we want to see maybe even the federal government step in and give us some funding towards finding private prosecutorial people who can, come in when law enforcement has occurrence of use of force, and they can do that job so that the community can be able to start trusting in the process. So right now we look at government, we see the city attorney moving not only throughout the Milwaukee Police Department, but the mayor's office and the FBC. So to me, it is really, not being done deliberately to create independence throughout even all those agencies. So, how can we get a true definition of independent investigations that will give us more trust in the fact that accountability will be done?
Commissioner Avalos, when we talk about police reform, and that seems to be the expression we use, what does that mean to you? What would that look like in practice to you?
I think starting with, the conversation back to, accountability. How do you get to accountability? It's critical, but you need that base understanding of how things are working here, the way our systems uphold each other, and the way we can change, whether it's an SOP, standard operating procedure, a policy within a fire or the police departments, or is it something that is bound to us through the state level, or is it on the federal level? You need to understand how and where these changes are made to then understand who you talk to make certain changes, or to gain a different understanding, or who makes which decisions about what. I think that level of political education is one of my first priorities in this role. I see that conversation being had across the city more and more, which is awesome. And I think that's what we need to be continuing to invest in, is to have that, collective understanding about who's doing what, to then understand like the bigger picture of okay, we know that we want things to be changed. This is not working, what we're doing. We have different people in different leadership positions. And I think I'm hearing a lot of the same message of like, this isn't working. We want to do something better. We're here for the people. We want to listen. We want to show up and actually create that trust. And I think just, having that collective conversation like we're doing right now, having these conversations about what is working, what are you seeing on your side? What is your perspective? What are your ideas? My role as a commissioner, I think, is just I'm hearing these conversations that are being had in the community, and I want to bring this to the table about, there's some concern about a certain SLP, or there's something that we've seen for years now that is concerning. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what changes need to be made, whether it's an amendment to an SLP, or whether it's just be more vocal during a fire and police commission meeting about, okay, we voted in this way because we went through this, and this. We had the discussion. We brought everybody to the table to talk about, every part of this, and then we get to our decision. So it's more an open and transparent conversation instead of, more closed door, closed session type stuff. There are some things that need to be, in closed session, whether it's like a HR, a legal matter, but anything else that's, procedural or part of, the public perspective or the public process, I think that needs to be had in public as much as possible. And I want to make sure that I'm doing my part to make that happen. In terms of police reform, I think it's a term that some folks agree with and some folks do not agree with. I think there's the level of change that needs to happen on the local law enforcement level is so enormous. I think folks are, kind of rejecting the reform word, but we need to start with having those conversations about what we're able to compromise on and what we're not, because there are some things that we need, especially like public safety, we're not going to compromise on. And we're going to do the work to have these little conversations step by step, have progress in the right direction until we get there. So,
Chief Norman, what are you open to now you're the acting police chief, but what are you open to in terms of reform? Is this changes in, for example, standard operating procedures, which we've heard referred to? Is it changing in recruiting practices to get a more diverse force? What specifically would the department be open to when we talk about police reform?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, Mike, just from the standpoint that no option should be off the table. I don't believe any leader who's worth their salt will say, I'm not willing to listen or talk to any conversation in regards to whether it's the reimagination of the police department or looking at other options. As we all know, we have come to a point in the law enforcement profession where we really have to reexamine what is the expectations of the services. How are we able to best provide services? What is within our purview? I tell people all the time, our prime directive is law enforcement. That is ensuring that we are going to hold people accountable for the breaking of the law. Now, where things got to get a little bit muddled is all the other things that's been heaped onto the law enforcement community that we have to really have a hard discussion about. What does that look like, and how do we go about supplying or having these services done, and by whom? One of the big things that's talked about right now within all parts of our, organizations, different city leaders and community is mental health. It's the elephant in the room that, we definitely see that there is some needs and things that we can work on together. And I say that the police department is part of the conversation, but we're not the solution. We need to understand that there are other individuals. I mean, you talked about I have a law degree. Well, my area of expertise is law. We have to bring in psychologists. We have to bring in therapists, those who are subject matter experts in their respective roles. So for us, I believe that, if we want to talk about civilianization and making civilianized positions, if you want to talk about regards to what's going to be the roles, expectations, as a leader of the department, I fully expect to be part of those conversations to provide my own perspective. But when it comes to, working towards a different future, a revised future, we have to have those conversations and see what is going to be the walking orders moving forward.
Sheriff Lucas, and I guess this is also could be for Chief Norman. I mean, one of the things that you do hear, and I've heard this from police officers and police chiefs over the years, is that, you know, we're asked to do too many things. We are not mental health experts. We are not social welfare experts. And yet we perform some of those functions because of the nature of our job today. I guess the question is, if we're talking about reform, are we open to the idea of having other people do those jobs so that law enforcement can focus solely on its responsibility in terms of investigating crimes, stopping crimes? Are we open to that kind of, I don't know, I guess it's a reallocation of resources in some respects? I'll begin with Sheriff Lucas, and then if Chief Norman, if you want to add a thought to that, that's fine too. Sheriff Lucas?
Well, certainly that's one of the questions, one of the many questions that has to be answered, is just what exactly is it that the people in this community want of its police? There's 18,000 law enforcement agencies around the country, and they're there for reasons, because the folks in Palm Springs, California, or the folks in Harris County, Texas, the folks here in Milwaukee and Waukesha County, Wisconsin, they want police to deliver the level and the types of services that those communities are asking for. And so when we look at what things could we be doing or should we be doing, again, it's a conversation that myself and Chief Norman as leaders have to be open to listening to the people of this community and hearing from them what is it that they want of their police. And when we're able to do that as leaders, to listen to the people, I think we can start beginning the process of reimagining the police in terms of the delivery of its services. You talked about the issue of mental health. Again, we're not trained in that area. We're not professionals in that area. But maybe to deliver that service to the community, it might be a collaboration between the health professionals and law enforcement to address that issue. But there are a multitude of other issues that law enforcement respond to that we could be focusing our time in stopping crime and disorder if it were not for those other duties that we were doing. So again, we have a lot of conversations, a lot of discussions that have to be had, but it begins with each one of us, the chief and myself, being active listeners to what it is that the people of this community are desiring.
Chief Norman, I'll give you a quick chance to respond to that. You know, are we open to this idea of maybe we redirect resources that allows Milwaukee police officers to be freed up to do what they're sworn in to do?
Mike, we have to be. At the end of the day, again, we're public servants, and responding to the community is our directive, what our city leaders, what our community wants. I'm all ears in conversations about what does that look like. But in the meantime, we have to understand the challenges. I mean, officers are made, split-second decisions, unfortunately, because of the responsibilities being, placed upon them, which we take with pride, and we do it as best as we can. I mean, with the CIT program, there's a lot of different programs out there that we're getting ourselves up to speed. The law enforcement of yesterday is not the same as today, but we definitely have to have these conversations, and robust and also solution and action-based discussions, because I think this is getting to the point where the can keeps on getting kicked down the road. And we're seeing that things are not being addressed properly, that we have to really make some hard decisions. So absolutely 100% be part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Nate Hamilton, you've been a part of some of those conversations. Are you optimistic that there can be change that you think would address the concerns of the community, but also address concerns of law enforcement officers?
And I think it's just a complete investment into the mental state of not only community members, but law enforcement as well. Because I completely understand that the mental strain on law enforcement is heavy, right? When you're dealing with individuals within this community, whether it's violent or whether non-violent, officers deal with a lot mentally and preparing themselves for that job. So, we look at mental health within police, departments, and we also look at mental health in communities. And then we look at the reason why we ask for divest to de-invest in the police department is to look at creating funds to help bring in different agencies to help with mental health issues. And I've been looking around the country, and there's different places around this country now that's sending out the fire department to deal with mental health calls first and foremost before police officers arrive to those scenes. So I think we just have to really sit down with law enforcement and with our city councilmen and leaders and say, hey, how can we protect not only community members, but law enforcement as well? Because mental health is everywhere. If we wake up and we have a bad attitude, it's triggered through the strain of life. And I think we all go through those strains within our daily life, whether it's family or whether it's friends or whether it's just trying to survive throughout this pandemic at this time. So, Mr. Norman just talked about CIT training. It's something that me and my family have pushed for because we want to make sure that, the officers are knowledgeable of people with mental health, the different types of mental health and how to, deal with those things, how to address them and how to comfort people in the midst of their them just maybe having a issue in that moment. And we want to be sensitive towards those matters. And I think if we invest in those trainings, if we continue to gain knowledge and understanding around the city, and say, okay, let's be better. Let's approach these things with a different look. And I think when he said therapist, psychologist, those things have to be instituted into the Milwaukee Police Department. I think officers have to take on the duty of being checked up on, to letting out their grievances and what's bothering them. And I still think that within the police department that there should be officers who deal with violent crime reduced to different places within the department over time, because how often can you just go in to a job and just see violence or be stricken with rudeness, rude behaviors, and then not weigh on your mental capacity. So we need to find ways to move officers around, to give them a cool down period and do other things that will help us be a better community and police department.
Commissioner Avalos, one of the challenges anytime you talk about change is sort of what does the moment look like? And the moment in Milwaukee has been challenging over the last year because we have seen an increase in shootings and homicides, a record number of homicides. And yet we're having conversations about doing things differently. Is that an easy conversation to have right now, given the timing, given other things that are happening in the community? How do we have that conversation when you know that some people will say, we cannot change the number of police officers, we can't scale back resources because if we do, we will see more crime? How do you go about having that kind of complicated conversation?
That's a great question, Mike. It's to answer the first part of the question. No, it's not easy. But yes, it's worth it. I think this is, in my experience and, through community organizing in different roles. And I've gotten to see different neighborhoods, work with different neighborhoods and see where folks are at, see where the concerns are, see where the pressures and stresses are that Nate touched on both sides. I've gotten to know officers that, patrol the same neighborhoods every day. Everybody knows them, and the same community members who know them. And I think that's part of what I think propels us forward as well. We have to be courageous in these moments, especially if, you're sitting in a position with a certain authority with a stake in this conversation. And I think we've seen that today with Chief Norman, Sheriff Lucas, and Nate. We're all committed to this conversation. We want to make sure that this is continued, that we're being creative, and that we are taking into perspective everyone's accounts of where they're coming from. And like you said, the pandemic has different stressors on us, and that's showing up in different ways, and there's different reasons for that. But I think that this is part of that work, and that conflict is necessary to do that, to get to the change that we need to see. this, and it's happening. It's been happening for years, and I've been only part of it for, I'd say, like at least 7 strong years. Got to know Nate, I would say, like 7 years ago, and things are changing. The conversation is changing across the city. 7 years ago, the FPC was not a hot topic in the media. Now it is, and I think this, the more we talk about these things, and the more we're going to get there. That reimagining piece of this conversation is critical. And like this, and Chief Norman touched on this too, we need to be imaginative of like what things can change. And honestly, anything can change. We have complete control over our systems. We uphold, perpetuate different things through different ways. The budget is outside of the role of a commissioner of my seat, but it is the Common Council. But my role as a commissioner has purview over like the policies and disciplining. And I think it has to be a collective conversation, because everybody has different ways that we can make these changes, and this different opinions as well. And this is how we're going to get there. And I think we are getting there. It's worth it. It's difficult, and it's absolutely worth it, because in the end, we might be saving people's lives. We might be, and I mean, honestly, just want to make people healthier. We want a community that can thrive and feel safe. And we get there only if we are taking into account the folks that are the most marginalized and the most harmed. So, yeah.
Do you feel that there is common ground? It sounds like you're saying there is common ground to be found, and yet, knowing some of your past work, I mean, you definitely wanted big changes in terms of how we allocate resources in the city. And my guess is that, and I want to speak for Chief Norman or for Sheriff Lucas, but my guess is they might prefer something more modest than that. But you do believe there's common ground to be found there, correct?
I'd say, yeah, ideologically, like we want to live in a city where we all feel safe, where we feel heard, where we feel protected. And people's ideas of how we get there are different. But I think there's common ground in wanting that feeling and security. At the end of the day, you want your family to be safe. You want to be able to go to work and come back home to your family afterwards. And I think that's common ground. We all want to, and if we have a stake in this, anything is, everything is inherently political, but like if you have a stake in any of these public conversations, then I think you are in some way at least committed to that, and to seeing Milwaukee thrive and like get to a better place in that progress. So there's the common ground. I know that there are enormous pressures in my 2 months of my nomination process. I saw and I went through like so much pressure from every side. Folks are feeling very vocal, very passionate about what they believe. And yeah, I think it's worth it, because we need to get past this conflict of, feeling weird about having these conversations, or the reimaginative piece. I know that people have different stakes in that, whether it's a tradition to have been in law enforcement for generations in your family versus folks who don't have that experience, or, we're tied to different parts of these systems in different ways. And that's human, that's natural. And I think what's necessary is being committed to the common ground pieces, and like being open to hearing different perspectives, and like people are having different experiences from the same police and fire departments. And we're not going to get anywhere if we continue to just, not change anything systemically, and, not really hear each other in these conversations. If we just keep talking about it just to talk about it, we're not going to get anywhere. But I really believe that the people that are here and having these conversations want to actually make that change, and understand already how difficult it is to make even just the smallest amounts of change. This is how that happens.
Nate Hamilton, and then I'll come back to Chief Norman and Sheriff Lucas. Do you feel closer to making some of the changes that you and others feel? It seems like the avenues of communication have been somewhat more open in recent months. Are you optimistic about being able to find the common ground we were just speaking of being able to bring about change that can work for not just citizens of the community, but for law enforcement officers too?
Yeah, I'm committed, completely, Mike. Even as chair for the Community Collaborative Commission, we are completely committed, and I think Chief Jeff Norman, he will tell you that, and his officers have been completely committed to sitting at the table with us and working hard with us to create this the COP, which is community-oriented policing policy, that will, we look at it as helping strengthen the relationship, right? Helping us get a better forward. And what we've been doing, even though we found that common ground of just wanting safety and peace, we just been scratching at the surface. And I think it's time to open the box on our ideas. And if those ideas do not work, then we go to the next box, and we don't just scratch that box. We open it up too and see what we can get out of it. And we continue to move forward with the understanding that everything is not going to work perfectly. We're going to have to, to tighten up, loose screws along the way. We're going to have to, intervene in some way to make sure that we complete the process in full. And, creating the SOP, the COP has, gave us the understanding that, we're putting this forward. We're expecting the FPC to vote on that, soon, so we can move that policy forward. But we know that it might not be perfect. It might need to be fixed along the way. It might be some things that does work and does not work. So, we're open on both sides, the commission and the police department, to say, okay, let's evaluate these things after a while. Let's audit them. And let's see if we can, get better. But let's, be effective. Let's make sure that we actually take our time in creating and giving the strength and opportunity to this policy for it to grow and for it to enhance the relationship between community and police. And if we lack, which we have been doing, I think we have had these conversations, which are just surface scratching conversations for years and years and years, and no one wants to open the box. So I think it's time for the city to open up the box of respect. I think it's time for us to open up the box of love, and compassion and determination, and not always continue to look at being optimistic, right? So I think if we move forward and challenge ourselves, at the highest level, and saying, hey, until we try, we will not succeed. And I'm grateful that, even Sheriff Lucas, seeing the difference in the sheriff department since he took, that leadership role is, it gives me, a great deal of that, this city has leaders that are capable of putting us in a better position. And, we're just looking at it as citizens right now and saying, hey, just listen to us, trust in us. If we can't formulate it ourselves as citizens, then put the leadership around us to help formulate those things so we can have the best outcome.
Sheriff Lucas, you and Chief Norman here have spoken about the importance of leadership and about the role you see yourselves playing in terms of leadership. But let me ask another question. How does your department feel about change, generally speaking? How does the rank and file feel about it? You hear stories about police officers feeling unappreciated or underappreciated. They feel like they're sort of under attack. Are the members of your department, Sheriff Lucas, on board with change?
That's a great question you asked, Mike, and one that I addressed with my command staff here just recently. One thing that's inevitable in our profession is change, but the one thing that we're most resistant to in law enforcement is that change. And whether it was change in the form of talk about the Miranda decision in 1964 that changed the way we did interrogations and interviewing persons in custody, or even modern day with the advent of the body-worn camera, which law enforcement was adamantly opposed to. But I am an advocate for, because it will open up eyes and windows to what it is that we do as a profession. looking back now 60 plus years at Miranda, while our criminal justice system still has its pockmarks and some warts, it's still one of the finest systems of jurisprudence in the world. And at the same time, while body cameras have not answered all of our questions thus far, I see it revolutionizing law enforcement in a way that, again, we can be more accountable to the people we serve. Change is something that, as leaders, Chief Norman and myself, have to continually communicate to our members. It's not just simply come in and write a new policy. It's not come in and simply say we're trying a new policing philosophy. We have to continue to address the changes in the country, the changes in right here in our own communities, and begin the substantive conversations internally, preparing our members for those changes. And the better we are, the better law enforcement leaders are at communicating to its members early and often, the better we as a profession can and will adapt to change in our profession.
Chief Norman, is the rank and file on board with the idea of change? What do you see? What do you hear?
I always say that the important aspect of getting the rank and file in order is leadership. And I just talked at our recent promotional ceremony for some future leaders in regards to lieutenants and sergeants, and recognize them for the importance that they play in change. If the leadership don't embody the change, do not understand the why behind the change, it is a difficult process. Bureaucracy is not something that it works well with fluid. That's not something that is a known concept within, multi-layers and red tape and things like that. So as Sheriff Lucas had, referred to, cops don't like the way things are, but don't want things to change either. So it's kind of, always a constant battle, but leadership takes a critical part in being part of that change, modeling and showing that we are embracing and okay with the change, because at the end of the day, we have to grow. We have to understand what is a new way of doing things, a better way of doing things. And again, being responsive to our public in regards to the relationships that we have out there. So I'm very optimistic. I'm willing to meet, work with, I saw that Director Moore was on this programming with OVP or the Milwaukee Homicide Review Commission, or work with the CCC, even meeting with the community activists, being that is part of our community. We as leaders cannot show ourselves to only talk to certain individuals or certain. We have to be open to be part of discussions to understand how can we all work towards change.
I want to ask each of you and Sheriff Lucas, about something we found last June. We did a poll at Marquette Law School, and which we do a lot of polling here, obviously. And we did a poll. This was not long after the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. And we asked people, how would you describe your feelings about police in your community? And the question said, do they make you feel mostly safe or mostly anxious? 90% of our white respondents said mostly safe. 43% of our Black respondents said mostly safe. Half that number. 44% of Black respondents said it makes them feel anxious, police. As leaders in your department, as Black men, do you understand that? How does that feel and read to you when you hear something like that very different way in how police are viewed? And I'll begin with Chief Norman.
Thank you, sir. I definitely have a moment of confliction, and there is no secret in regards to some of the things I've said in the past. I am a Black man first, officer in the uniform second in regards to that. Is part of my entire reality of being in this profession for almost 25 years. Understand that there are concerns out there, and they have legitimacy in regards to those concerns. We have to be honest in these conversations and say that we are not going to do better, but committed to do better. And that's showing our actions are aligning with our words. You cannot say certain things and we're not having the actual examples of showing where that commitment lays and how we're moving towards that. There's a lot of challenges with our law profession. I still say this, even after 25 years, I'm absolutely proud to be part of this profession. COVID-19 brought a lot of challenges in 2020. our officers showed up in the heat of, all the things that were going on with the COVID-19, the challenges of violent crime, the challenges in regards to, exposing themselves to the virus, but yet still being out there in the front lines. Absolutely proud in regards to what we have been accomplishing and what we can accomplish more. But I'm also honest. We have a lot of things to work on, a lot of things that we need to address. And as leaders, we have to be vocal about it, but also have the deeds to show that we're not playing about it. I will not accept anything less than professional behavior in the city of Milwaukee. As a current resident, as I've always been a resident, as a family members who live in this city, I expect nothing less. And so there is things that we have to work on to bridge that divide. The police department have to be in those public spaces and other spaces that we've never been before, or rekindling those relationships that we have torn asunder. I'm committed to do that. I want to be a part of that. And I expect my command staff and the profession to be part of that also.
Sheriff Lucas, the poll just finds a fundamental difference in the way police or law enforcement officers are viewed by Black and white citizens. I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. How do you feel about that?
Well, I totally understand it, Mike. As someone who was born here in the Hillside Housing Project, whose life was formed and shaped after the 67 disturbances here in Milwaukee, and then to watch continual incidents, policing that negatively impacted and affected communities of color, and even more recent with the some of the decisions and acts that have taken place here by law enforcement, I can understand why people feel the way they do toward their policing. We have got to change our recruiting so that we're getting the officers from the community who are part of the community and who represent the best of our community. We have got to look at better ways to train and prepare those officers for interacting with the community. It just can't be 23 weeks at our academy and you're ready. No, it's a continual process of introducing, whether it's cultural bias or other training, de-escalation training and other trainings to our members. So we have a lot of work to do. But yes, I totally understand it because I'm a product of this community. I'm a Black man and I have lived it for all my life as well. And unless and until we get past that point where even the sheriff of Milwaukee County can feel secure and safe when he's not in his uniform, then I can understand how people of color, women, immigrants feel about their police. And that's the work that I continue to strive for. And I know Chief Norman does as well.
I'd be curious to get some reaction from Nate Hamilton and Commissioner Avalos to what you've just heard from the two prominent leaders of law enforcement in this area on that topic. Nate Hamilton, I'll begin with you. Any thoughts?
I look at, police to me, I had bad encounters with police officers, not just Milwaukee, but all the way out to Elkhorn, to Dane, to Dane County, to Walworth County. I work all over the state. So what I see is I would love to build a relationship with officers. A lot of conversations that I had with willing officers were great conversations. It gave me a sense of their humanity. And I think that we don't get enough of that within our community, is having conversations to lock into that we are all humans. And I think that has to happen more. And when I look at those numbers that are 90% to 40%, it really gives off the message that police, their duty is to protect white bodies, and their duty is to protect white infrastructure. And I think it sends off a bad message, right? With those numbers in mind. And we have to look at saying, police officers in the city of Milwaukee, where I stay, I want to start building relationships. I want to start having conversations with officers. I don't want them to just continue to ride their bikes down my street and not wave or not say, how are you doing today? Is there anything that we can do? Is there any insight we can give you when it comes to law enforcement, or how to protect yourself, or how to just be more vigilant in your community. I think we all, excuse me, we all have to start teaching each other and participating and bettering one another through knowledge. So I think that we look at it and say, oh, just too much responsibility. Well, life is responsibility. Safety is responsibility. Compassion and respect is responsibility. So we have to show that on all levels. And that should not be looked at as a job or a description of a job. It should just be a description of humanity. And, until we get to that point, I think that we are going to have anxiety within our community when it comes to law enforcement.
Amanda Avalos, I'll give you a chance to respond to what you heard from Chief Norman and Sheriff Lucas about their experiences, their view of the perception of police in our community.
Yeah, I appreciate Chief Norman and Sheriff Lucas's perspective and honesty and really sharing your perspective there. I know you understand. I think we all understand what that feels like to be on the other side of not feeling protected, whether it's law enforcement, security, whatever. That I think is also part of like what unites us. And I think why I know that we are, having this conversation genuinely. I think the issue is more structural than individual. I know that, the history of like law enforcement and history of policing in Milwaukee specifically is loaded. And there's, systems have been built for many, many years, and there's different reasons for that. But I think we're here now. We have, we're in these positions, and we have this, different authorities to make changes where we sit. And I think this, having these conversations is how we get there. I know, and like I said, I appreciate, sharing your perspective. And this storytelling is how I think we also get to that change of just being honest and like, we can be critical about these systems, knowing that, yes, it comes with, history and generations of people and family and traditions. But this, is showing up in different ways that are harmful to the community in very real ways. And disproportionately with communities of color, Black, brown communities and neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And let's change that. We can change that. So let's be courageous and make those moves. And I think that I like what I heard from Chief Norman. Like let's work together on some of those things. Like our values seem to align in a lot of ways. And let's be creative and imaginative about what we can make happen and make real for Milwaukee, and especially in response to what the communities have been saying for years now.
So I'll ask each of you as we begin to wrap things up here to talk about the next step. I mean, this is good. This is a conversation that I think is a serious conversation about where we might go in the future. But what do we do next? What is the next step to building the trust between community and law enforcement? I'll begin with you, Amanda, and we'll go right down the list here. Amanda first, and then Nate Hamilton second.
What's next? I think we continue to have this conversation. I know the CCC, Community Collaborative Commission, is working hard on their end. FPC is working hard on our end, the police department, leadership, the sheriff department as well. Like, let's continue to have these conversations. Let's be real and honest about where we're at. I think we started that here. And let's bring these ideas, continue to, have open spaces safely. I know we're still in a pandemic. Hopefully we'll get back to in-person soon, but we can continue to carve out these spaces and I think just be genuine about what we think we can do next. And honestly, I take baby steps as real progress because that's better than taking a step backwards. And I really feel like we are making the progress in the right direction these past couple of years in different ways. So I think, we're all here. We're all committed to at least the common ground, the values, the ideology of, wanting to have a safe city for everyone. Let's move forward with how we can figure out whether that's an amendment to an SOP or whether that's different ways of disciplining or whether that's just like how, departments or district stations are supervised in different ways. Let's be creative about how we can continue to manage and guide our relationships in a positive way while taking into account everybody's perspective, and that includes the community as well.
Nate Hamilton. Yeah, thank you. Nate Hamilton is chair of the Community Collaborative Commission. As the brother of Dr. Hamilton, what would you like to see be a next concrete step forward?
You know, I would like to, work with, Chief Norman and Sheriff Luke. I think if we can create a campaign that is building the bridge, right? We know that the bridge has been burned down, but we have to reestablish that bridge to cross. And that bridge is a bridge of communication, a bridge of creating dignity within law enforcement and within the community. So if that's something even Sheriff Lucas and Chief Norman is willing to talk to me about, is saying, hey, let's create a campaign called Building the Bridge. And we can work towards getting into the community, showing our humanity, showing our respect for one another, showing that we can share this space and create a safe and peace environment by working together, by acknowledging each other's, self-worth, self-value. I'm all about love and building people up, to encourage people and inspire people. And I think those things also have to be shown through law enforcement as well. Their ability to inspire, their ability to change, their ability to respect. So if we can work together and saying, let's build this bridge together, let's, compromise our feelings and our emotions and our past. Because sometimes our past hinders us from our future. So I don't hold on, I hold on to my brother's memory, but I don't hold on to the hurt, right? Because that would just deter me from wanting to reach greatness for the city. So, the memory of him, what I built with him is what leads me to continue to move forward and inspire people. The hurt would just, stop me and not help me realize the benefits of the position I'm in. So, I think we all have to look at moving forward and saying, hey, let's take that step forward. Let's take that step forward with the realization that this city can be great, but it can't be great unless we start taking steps in the correct direction.
Sheriff Lucas, Nate Hamilton is talking about building a bridge together. What do you think happens next in this conversation?
Well, Mike, let me thank you and Marquette University Law School for hosting this discussion, this dialogue. And certainly the things that I've heard today here from all four of our panelists, the panelists here, is encouraging and optimistic for our community and for the future of our community. The willingness to partner, the willingness to collaborate, and the willingness to build a bridge, as Brother Hamilton stated. If the goal of the law in this country, Mike, is to provide justice, then we all ought to seek that justice in every way. And when we see the disparities in the halls of justice, based on race, based on gender, based on socioeconomic status, we know that we still have a lot of work to do. And unless and until we level the playing field and make it equitable for everyone, regardless of their race or their gender or their socioeconomic status, to achieve that justice, then all of us will continually be having these discussions. I'm committed. It is my desire and my goal as someone who was born in this community and has been afforded many opportunities from being a product of this community to give back to this community until I have no more to give. And so I'm grateful for the words of Commissioner Avalos and again, Brother Nate Hamilton, and certainly committed to the goal of restoring justice here in our community and raising the tide for everyone in our community, leveling the playing field for everyone in our community and making our community a stronger and a safe place.
Chief Jeff Norman, you get the final word here. What's next in your mind?
Well, Mike, this is kind of a hard after hearing us greatness come from three other individuals. I've come in the rear, but again, to echo Sheriff Lucas' words, thank you to Marquette. Love the school. Great school, and you for allowing us to be part of this conversation. To build off what was discussed before me, goes back to one of my other tenets that I'm working on as a chief is community engagement. And I talk about it in a way that, too often community engagement in law enforcement is lollipops and ice cream out there playing around with kids basketball. And granted, that's a part of that construct, but it's all about discussions. It's about having conversations. Law enforcement needs to be in spaces they're not normally in to understand the true desires and fears and also concerns, but also solutions in our entire community. And we also need to reconnect in those where we've, again, maybe destroyed or have not been good curators of the relationships. Our job is to be part of the relationship building, which is I'm glad to hear from Brother Hamilton about having that campaign, that messaging, because as Stephen Covey says, we need to make trust deposits in our community because it's not a matter of if, but there's always a when that something comes up. How do we react in regards to those particular type of serious situations? Do we give the police department or other organizations a, let's hear them out first, or do we get into I always knew this is how it is? I believe that can help with that narrative is, again, having those relationships, those robust discussions, those honest discussions, those genuine discussions, and that we're all part of those discussions. I believe as leaders, we need to talk to everyone, not just some, but everyone, because our officers talk to everyone. They don't get a choice about who they can talk to when it calls for service. So we need to embody that and be part of those discussions. And I believe that is a great way to be able to, take care of what the needs are for the future. Thank you.
I want to say a special thank you to all four of you for participating in today's conversation. Commissioner Amanda Avalos, Chairman of the Community Collaborative Commission, Nate Hamilton, Sheriff Ernell Lucas, and Interim Acting Police Chief Jeff Norman. We greatly appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Mike and Marquette as well.
And now I'm for the legal perspective on how investigating and charging decisions are made in deadly force incidents. Let me turn things over to Steve Biskupik, who is a former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin and adjunct professor of law here at Marquette Law School. Again, thanks to all of you.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for participating in our panel today. I'd like to introduce first Josh Call, the Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. Josh is the highest ranking law enforcement officer in the state. Before becoming Attorney General, he served as a federal prosecutor. Josh is a graduate of Stanford Law School. Kimberly Motley is a defense attorney in private practice. She has an international law practice focusing on human rights. Here in Wisconsin, she's represented a number of families who have had a member of that family involved or a victim of a police shooting. Kim is a proud graduate of Marquette Law School. Happy to have her. And John Chisholm is a career prosecutor, and since 2007, he's been elected the district attorney in Milwaukee County, where he has primary decision-making authority, probably over more police shootings than anyone else in Wisconsin history. John is a graduate of Wisconsin Law School. And as Mike Gousha said, I'm Steve Biskupik. I'm an adjunct professor of law here at Marquette. I'm in private practice and served about 20 years as a federal prosecutor. I'd like to focus today on the investigation, charging, and discipline of police officers who are involved in shootings, fatal shootings of citizens, and whether or not and how they face charges. Let's jump in on the charging decision. Wisconsin has a law that says in order to criminally charge a police officer, the prosecution must prove that the officer did not act with a reasonable belief of danger to their own personal safety, life-threatening danger to their own personal safety or someone near them. Again, the officer who says that he or she feared for their life, if the prosecution cannot disprove that beyond a reasonable doubt, then there cannot be a conviction. Kim, you've been outspoken in your criticism of prosecutors' failure to issue charges. How much is that a product of the Wisconsin law that I cited, and would you like to see that law changed?
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm glad we're having this discussion. I definitely feel as though part of the problem that I have seen in dealing with officer-involved shootings and representing victims is that the investigations against the officers are very flawed. I believe that often the DAs are not given the tools that they need in order to effectively evaluate the officer involved shooting. And usually, from my experience, that comes from the fact that the investigation by other police officers, and in Wisconsin, it has to be an officer that's not employed by the same district under Wisconsin statute 175.47, that the investigation in and of itself is flawed, because that investigation is usually conducted by other law enforcement officers, fellow law enforcement officers, who basically are working more towards justification and less in conducting an investigation. So I think, by and large, that the laws, frankly, are adequate. I do think that the way that those laws are being interpreted and the way in which investigations are coming to the district attorney's office, often in very flawed investigations, I think that's the problem.
Josh, let's jump to the investigation stage a little bit. Wisconsin does have a law saying that a separate law enforcement agency must investigate the police shooting. Oftentimes that's your agency, the Division of Criminal Investigation. Is there enough independence by your law enforcement officers under the statute?
Yeah, well, first, Steve, thanks for having me, and it's good to be joining you today. I think it's important, I guess, that we start by sort of taking stock of where Wisconsin is and how it compares to some other parts in the country. We have a law in Wisconsin that's been in effect for several years now that requires that in a case in which an officer's action or inaction resulted in death, that an outside agency needs to be the agency that's conducting an investigation. That's a really good policy. A lot of states don't require outside agencies, though as a practical matter, a lot of agencies do require that. The Wisconsin Department of Justice's Division of Criminal Investigations conducts a lot of those investigations in Wisconsin, and as a result of that, we've developed some real expertise in those investigations. But we don't conduct all of them, and in fact, a lot of southeastern Wisconsin has those investigations conducted a different way. I think that the laws that we have are a good starting point, but I also think we can improve on them when it comes to making sure that there is a full and fair investigation conducted in some of these critical incident cases. One example of how I think we could improve the law is by expanding it so it doesn't just apply to cases where death has resulted, but to all cases involving critical incidents, so that if an officer fires his or her weapon and a person is injured, that there's required to be an outside agency investigating it as well. The other thing I want to mention on the standard for legal charging that I think is significant is, as we talked about just initially here, part of the standard is what is reasonable for an officer under the circumstances. And what's reasonable depends on a variety of things, including their training and what their office's policies are. And so I think there is room within that reasonableness framework to have a standard that is appropriately applied. But I think thinking through some of those elements that go into it is important.
Thank you. John, as I said, you probably face more of these charging decisions than anyone in the state. Is it good that we have this benefit of the doubt for law enforcement? And has it frustrated you, or are you content with the statute as it is?
I'm certainly not content. The points that have been raised by Kimberly and Josh are totally appropriate. And I think what you have to look at is the evolution of police accountability. And the 26 years I've been prosecuting, I have seen some significant changes. 2014 being one of those watershed years where the legislature passed what I would consider really to be kind of a watered down accountability bill. Because keep in mind that even on the issue of an outside independent agency, the statute actually reads that you have to have at least 2 law enforcement officers from another agency be the lead investigators. It never says that there has to be a completely independent investigation that takes place. And so that's one point to look at right there. In the ideal world, I think that you would have a body of trained, experienced investigators who were not responsive to the ordinary workload, you might say, in the respective jurisdictions. because it's often pointed out, right, the same agencies that are investigating the police officer involved shooting are also investigating all the other crimes that may or may be alleged to have occurred in the jurisdiction. And you expect that the district attorney's office is going to hear those allegations and assess those and develop a longstanding relationship with those agencies so that they can serve the victims in the community as well. So that's always been a factor that has to be looked at. The second issue that was debated and rejected was the independence of the review itself. If you go back to the legislative notes in 2014, the original bill actually included an outside independent reviewer, right? It was going to include a retired judge, someone from the Attorney General's office, a representative from the District Attorneys Association, an academic. So you were going to have an outside independent group that would review all these cases, and they would have had the ability to do further inquiries to determine additional facts, and then they would actually make a recommendation to the DA in the respective county. At that time, I thought, that would have been the perfect time to actually take that decision making to a completely independent entity, but that was rejected, and it's been rejected, pretty much throughout the country. So I think that's one area that could be looked at as well to add additional layers of independence. But let me also talk in practical terms. When an officer is involved in a fatal shooting, you also have an obligation to secure the evidence on that scene as quickly and professionally as possible. And so sometimes just the real world intrudes on that. You simply don't have the luxury sometimes of waiting hours and hours to secure the scene and collect the evidence. But the short answer is there's plenty of things that we can continue to do to make this a more transparent and accountable process.
Kim, what do you think the public and specifically your clients in these kind of cases would like to see? I mean, John makes a good point. If you have a shooting, it's something has happened very quickly and unexpectedly, and the first agency on the scene is the local law enforcement. They're going to touch the weapon. They're going to touch things. If you have a specialized group, whether it's within Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office or the Attorney General's office, it's going to take plenty of time for them to gather and get to the scene to conduct, what you want is the independent investigation. What would you like to see to create more independence, and what do you think would create more credibility in the community?
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with that. That definitely, officer safety is first and foremost something that officers have to think about. And for instance, as it relates to my cases, particularly in Wauwatosa, we understand, and my clients understand, that officers need to come, they need to secure the scene, that there's things that they need to do in order to make sure that they preserve the investigation, that they preserve the evidence and things like that. The problem is that didn't happen. We've seen, at least with the Jay Anderson shooting, for instance, who was shot and killed by Officer Mensah in June of 2016, that the Wauwatosa Police Department was not only securing the scene, but they were intruding on an investigation that they should have had nothing to do with, including, days later, trying to find witnesses and writing police reports on it. And so the bottom line is I think the community deserves and should have accountability for actions of law enforcement officers who are not behaving in a way that is appropriate or are frankly breaking laws themselves. And so I think that would help increase community confidence. If you see law enforcement officers who are held accountable for their actions, who are held, for instance, in the Jay Anderson shooting, and again, I keep bringing this up because it's a case that I'm currently involved in. The gun was taken from the passenger side seat by law enforcement officers, Wauwatosa officers, who claimed that they were doing that because of officer safety. And they did this after they opened the driver's side door and Jay Anderson fell over in the driver's side door. Then they came and just without gloves on, just took the weapon out of the car. And so, I think again, you're going to hear me say this throughout the hour, there has to be accountability. There has to be consequences for this, because what is the consequence that happens if you have law enforcement officers who are tampering with a scene after it's been secured, after the investigative body takes it over and it says, we are in charge of this scene, we are in charge of this investigation, and yet the department continues to tamper with that? Where's the accountability? What's the consequence to that? And I think once the community sees that that's just not okay and that there are consequences to that, then I think you'll have more confidence that you'll get with community members.
Josh, I'm sorry. Josh, the AG's office oversees officer training standards by law. They have to be trained in a proper way. Would it help to have a specialized group within your office that only investigated police shootings and had a certain amount of independence from the day-to-day law enforcement that John Chisholm describes?
The way we have it set up currently in our office is that depending on which part of the state the shooting happens in, different senior leaders in our Division of Criminal Investigations are responsible for overseeing the investigation. But because our agency handles so many cases where there's an officer-involved critical incident, many of the investigators at the Division of Criminal Investigation have developed real expertise in handling officer-involved shooting cases. But it is important to note we don't handle all officer-involved shooting cases around the state. And so I can speak to how we approach them. And I think John could speak better to how other agencies do. But I do think it is helpful to have consistent expert investigators who are handling these kinds of cases, people with experience in them, because they do present complicated issues. We were talking about the issue about freezing the scene and having officers who are part of the agency that the person who's the officer involved in the shooting may work at. One of the things we work hard at is to make sure that we maintain the independence and the integrity of our investigations. And you're doing that, of course, in the midst of resource constraints. There are no agencies that are able to just quickly respond with dozens of officers as you may need to conduct some of these investigations. And what we do is we make sure that any officers who are part of the agency that was involved in the critical incident are not playing any sort of central role in the process. If there is any effort to sway the investigation, that's inappropriate and it shouldn't happen. Another thing that's critical to do, though, is to.
But just real quick on that, what's the consequence, though, if someone does tamper with an investigation for an officer?
Well, if there were proof that somebody had tampered with an investigation improperly, they'd be subject to being charged criminally. I have a lot of confidence in the integrity of the investigators at the Division of Criminal Investigation. And one of the things we do, though, to make clear to the public what's happened in these investigations is as soon as a charging decision is announced, if somebody's not charged, that information is released to the public right away so that the public can review the evidence and they can examine for themselves whether or not the charging decision was appropriate. Contrast that with what we saw in Kentucky, for example, in the incident involving Breonna Taylor, where there was a sort of extended debate about whether the materials were going to be released. Having those materials released right away is critical.
John?
Yeah, so keep in mind as well that we're talking about a iterative process that changes and hopefully improves with legitimate criticism and outside perspectives, which I think should not be looked at defensively. We should embrace those and consider them. For me, the thing that could have occurred in 2014, along with even a more robust outside independent investigative capacity and review capacity, if right at that point in time they had mandated body cameras, which were available at the time, and then the state actually assisted the local law enforcement agencies in obtaining those, that would have resulted in a measurably better quality of evidence starting in 2014. You're seeing more and more agencies understand the importance of having that. Not that it is the be-all, end-all. It isn't. But from my experience, again, having reviewed hundreds of these prior, whether it was fatal, non-fatal, death in custody. Anytime you had some contemporaneous recording of the event, it just helps immeasurably to define what actually did or didn't happen. And it also informs the issue of reasonableness, right? Because the vast majority of our decision is based on the investigative interview of the officer involved, because you're obviously not going to get that from the decedent. And so if there aren't a lot of outside independent witnesses to the incident, you're oftentimes left with what does the officer articulate as the basis for doing what they're doing. With the advent and increased adoption of body-worn cameras, it gives you the ability to parse that much finer than you could in the past. So again, I look on that as not just an improvement, but it should be something that is required and encouraged and funded by the state, so that the public does have greater accountability on these incidents.
Let me give, for our audience, let's use a practical example. Seems to me that, and all four of us have had cases involving these type of situations. But if a suspect has a firearm or other dangerous weapon in their hand or within reach, is it a practical impossibility to disprove that the law enforcement officer feared for their safety? I mean, really, in a lot of these controversial shootings by law enforcement officers, the officer will say, I feared for my safety. And you want to see the biggest proof of my fear? There's a gun right over there that was pointed near me or within reach. And it becomes very, very difficult for law enforcement, state, federal, to make a charging decision when that objective piece of evidence is so close at hand. John, let's go back the other way. Start with you. I mean, that's your common case that you're faced with, correct?
It is, and it has to be contextualized, right? And that is that the subset of cases that we're discussing, police-related violence, occur in a context of broader community-related violence. So in the city of Milwaukee last year, we had 191 homicides, almost 800 non-fatal shootings. You had, 37 of those, or 27 of those involved people under the age of 18. Probably 85% of those cases involved firearms. And so you're dealing in a context that is real. It can't be ignored. Now you have to take the existing substantive law as it relates to homicide. You have to add on to that the privilege, which is defined as an officer having the privilege, the right, the authority to use force to effect an arrest. And then you have to merge that with the affirmative self-defense language. And anytime a gun is present, self-defense is going to be an issue. And it's not just an issue in the context of reading it as the standard elements. You have to also now insert the element of the officer's training and experience. It becomes incorporated into the self-defense instruction itself. That in turn leads you to have to examine very closely the Department of Justice standards that all officers are trained to. It's incorporated in the Defense and Arrest Tactics Manual that basically says, look, if an officer encounters a situation and the situation they're encountering, the person has a weapon, they have a means of delivering lethal force with that weapon, and they demonstrate any kind of intent whatsoever. But if those three standards are met, they are privileged or justified in using deadly force. Now, the distinction being for officers, they can never use that deadly force to kill somebody, right? They are trained that the only legitimate use of that force is to stop that threat. But from a prosecutor's standpoint, having a person that has been trained to articulate that the only time that they are authorized to use deadly force is to stop a threat, it runs straight into the elements of intent, right? Because generally all we have to show is that somebody caused another person's death and they did that intentionally. Well, that's kind of built into any officer involved shooting. unless it's accidental, which is extremely rare. So if it is done because they're perceiving a threat, it is by definition intentional. And so you automatically have to disprove beyond a reasonable doubt that their perceptions were not reasonable. So yes, it's a really high standard. It's a difficult standard, and it's been explored in court, and not just here, but around the country. Juries find these cases very, very difficult. But again, I'll make the exception. Body cameras are allowing us to see things that traditionally we haven't been able to see. So some of the and not just body cameras, but sort of surveillance from the general community is allowing us to see things that we never saw before. So sometimes we are able to approach a case in ways that we never would have been before, because we can objectively assess whether or not that threat was objectively reasonable at that time.
Josh, I'd like you to follow up on that, particularly the officer training that tells them, or that allows them, when they start firing the gun, that they should keep firing until the threat is eliminated. And so you get these instances in which someone is shot multiple times, and especially with semi-automatic weapon, you can discharge a dozen bullets in a fraction of a second. The public, I think, certainly, and I think Kim would verify this, doesn't quite comprehend what John Chisholm just said. For lawyers, that I think most lawyers get it, and in some ways, some of the public might say, good, we want to make it difficult to charge police officers. We want to give them the benefit of the doubt. From a state perspective, again, recognizing that you also carried some federal background, what's your thoughts on that kind of analysis and the training that the officers get?
Well, I think we're getting at what I think is a really core issue to this debate, which is the legal standard, and part of our responsibility in training officers, of course, is to train them on what the law is. And that legal standard is a difficult one to meet. John's absolutely right that having body-worn cameras can help provide better and clearer evidence for potential prosecutions. But remember, a prosecutor has to prove not just that an officer acted unreasonably, but that has to do so beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high standard on the one hand. On the other hand, we have this conception of when somebody should be arrested. And you can only make an arrest if you're an officer if you have probable cause to make an arrest. So what that leaves us with is a pretty big gap between when an arrest can be made and when charges may be brought for an officer-involved shooting. To me, what that says is that we need to figure out a way to address that gap through policy. One of the ways I think we can do that is through a uniform statewide use of force policy. Some police departments right now, their use of force policy just mirrors that legal defense standard. But I think it's clear that there's a difference in view with the general public and with those in law enforcement about when force is appropriate to be used. And I think one way we can address that gap and help rebuild some trust is by having use of force policies that go beyond the minimum baseline of what an officer legally is privileged to do, but instead promote the kind of values that we want to make sure an officer is encountering that situation with. So, for example, ensuring that preservation of human life is one of the things that an officer is taking into account. Ensuring that officers are using de-escalation tactics whenever possible to try to de-escalate a situation. Those things would have some impact on the legal standard because they would help shape what would be considered reasonable. But they would also then, separate from the criminal charging issue, create employment standards that are higher and hopefully would lead to reduced numbers of critical incidents.
Can you just address real quick before I go to Kim, why the law allows an officer to keep shooting? I mean, again, I think that's one of the disconnects between lawyers and the public is the public hears the number of shots and they are startled, oh, he shot somebody 5 or 6 times. Why don't they just pull the trigger once like we see on TV? Why is it that the training and the law permit an officer to keep firing?
So there's both some history to this and some legal analysis that's relevant. Part of the history is that there were some incidents where officers would fire and then assess the situation, and then they were injured in response. The legal piece of it is that under the standard we've been talking about, the standard is that as long as the officer reasonably believes there's a threat, he or she is allowed to act in self-defense. And until, as John said, the threat has been eliminated, legally speaking, that standard remains. Now, I think as a policy matter, we should continue to assess the data on this, and we should look and see how these cases are playing out in practice. And we should craft our policies around what type of policy best promotes the preservation of life. And that's going to require more data and more analysis. And this is a separate issue, but there's unfortunately not great data on these issues from around the country. The more that we can gather that data, the better policy decisions we can make.
Kim, the family members don't get it right about the multiple shootings.
Well, I mean, I don't think they should get it, frankly. I think the officers are trained to stop the threat, as John and Josh have both acknowledged, and they're right, but they're not trained to assassinate the threat. And I think, frankly, in the cases that I'm involved in, it's not as though a gun goes off on itself. It's, as a human being, you're manipulating the trigger, how many times you shoot. I've shot a weapon before. I know how guns work. We all know how guns work, And so I think that's part of the problem, in addition to the credibility of, frankly, the specific officer that's involved in these incidents. It's telling that between 2013 through 2020, October 2020, that there were 27 officer-related shootings, and 22 of those victims were African Americans. And so I think, unfortunately, race does definitely play a factor in police assessing threats. If an African American has a gun, I think it's seen as more threatening than if a Caucasian person has a gun. And I think we've seen a little bit of that this summer. We know that's the stat in Milwaukee County, that there are 27 deaths and 22 were of African Americans for a 7-year time period. With, for instance, Wauwatosa, we know that 83% of the arrests in 2018 were of African Americans in a community that has less than a 6% African American population. We know in Kenosha during the protests this summer that while there were many self-proclaimed people who were helping the police running around with weapons, that not one single person was arrested at the night of the protest for the Jacob Blake shooting, but there were over 150 people who were unarmed that were arrested by police because they were the ones that police found probable cause to arrest them. And all the 150 people that were arrested, they were all protesting for essentially police accountability, and not one single pro-police protester was arrested, including a person that shot and killed 2 people and nearly shot and killed a 3rd person. So I think that's the problem, is that the way that officers are assessing threats is very, very different racially. And again, it goes to accountability. And I agree I'm glad to hear with what Josh was saying and what John is saying. I agree that body-worn cameras are really, really important to have. And I also agree that there should be a separate office that deals specifically with officer-related shootings. And we definitely want people that are experienced in those investigations, but also we need to recognize that people that are investigating also need to be reflective of the community. There needs to be more women that are part of those task force. There needs to be more people of color that are part of those investigative task force. That's really, really important. And I think we need to really understand that if we want to try to gain more community support with, the Attorney General's office or with John's office, Milwaukee County District Attorney's office. And it's not as though the public wants to distrust the police. I think the public definitely wants to trust the police, but unfortunately there's so many examples of late where that trust has been really challenging.
If I could just speak briefly to that, Steve.
Sure.
Look, Kim's points are spot on, and it points to the issue of greater diversity within law enforcement itself. Law enforcement recognizes that, and it's only made more difficult when there are high-profile police shooting cases that cause the community to question that relationship. But there's no question that the departments have to diversify. But I'd also argue that we tend to lock into accountability as only being charging a police officer with a crime. in these circumstances. And I think the experience that both Kim and you, Steve, worked on this summer actually points you in the direction of a parallel track that should be every bit as important, and it should be taking place at the same time that we're doing a criminal investigation on whether it was a lawful use of force or not. And that should be a very robust and, again, well investigated independent review to look at whether the processes that were followed met the departmental standards themselves, right? So that there would always be two potential tracks of accountability. And there always is the third track, which is a civil lawsuit, which has different standards, and which is important. I'm not depreciating that, but I think that one thing that has to occur is that the local fire and police commissions, police and fire commissions, that they have to actually take a stronger role. In the past, I've had the executive director of the Fire and Police Commission actually show up on scene right after the incident occurred to begin that process right away. I think that there are steps that could be taken so that even if the ultimate decision is that the DA says, look, I'm not going to be able to meet my burden of convicting the officer of a criminal offense, there could contemporaneously be a decision on whether or not the use of force met the departmental standards or just the standards that community believes reflect what they want out of their police agency.
And could I add to that real quick?
Sure.
And again, I think we're going to agree with a lot of what everyone's saying, and I agree with what John is saying, that and Steve, you and I were involved obviously with the Wauwatosa incident, that the internal investigation is so vitally important, that it's really important, like Josh was saying, to look at the police training. Was it followed? But the problem has been with at least the situations I've been involved with is that, for instance, the Alvin Cole investigation, the internal investigation, not the investigation by the district attorney's office, but the internal investigation was literally just completed 5 days ago. I just got a letter today. And yet there have been statements out there that it was justified according to the department, according to the internal investigation that wasn't even completed. With the Jay Anderson case, that internal investigation took over a year and a half. And during that time, the officer was still working on the scene, and of course, they found nothing wrong with what happened. It's almost like they had to find nothing wrong. And so if the internal investigations have integrity within them, I think they're very important to do. But if they don't, then it's just going through the motions.
Josh, I think the cases that Kim and John are mentioning is obviously these high-profile shootings in Wauwatosa that were reviewed, and the three of us were involved in different ways. One of the things that the public probably doesn't realize about Wisconsin law is, in order to remove a police officer, to discipline a police officer, you have to have essentially a separate hearing. You have to be able to show a specific rule violation that rises to the level of just cause. And then you have to show that for the good of the department, the officer should be removed. And it's a very public sort of human resources discipline issue, but it's one that tends to take longer. It tends to follow on the heels of a criminal investigation by the district attorney. I think what Kim is saying and John is proposing and tried to propose during the Wauwatosa was to try to run some of these things parallel so that the public can see the results at the same time. So it's not just a district attorney saying, look, there's not enough evidence, but that doesn't mean the officer didn't act improperly or aggressively or something like that. What's your thoughts on the state, laws and the state standards that would run these things sort of concurrently instead of separately as a way of raising credibility with the public?
Yeah, so first I think it's important to sort of note the point about timeliness here that's been discussed, because that comes up a lot in these cases. And I think there are two things that are important that we balance. One is these investigations need to happen quickly. We aim at, in our Division of Criminal Investigation, to complete their portion of the investigation within 30 days, which compared to most criminal investigations is extremely fast. Now, sometimes the facts and circumstances complicate matters, but moving quickly we think is important given how much impact these cases have on the public. Likewise, with the internal investigations, there's a benefit to having that decision close in time to when you have a charging decision announced. The counter to that is, the flip side of that is, we want to make sure we're getting these right to the extent we can as well. And that means you don't cut corners in the investigation, you don't cut corners in the process. The challenge that's out there with the internal investigation running concurrently with the criminal investigation is that, first of all, those folks who are internal to the agency under Wisconsin law are not allowed to play this significant role in the criminal investigation. And you certainly have issues that arise when you've got somebody being potentially interviewed in a employment context at the same time they might be the subject of a criminal investigation. So there are complications there for sure, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working to improve the process and that we can't try to have those decisions come as quickly as possible after a charging decision has announced. And one thing I think happens too much is that once the decision is made about once the charging decision is announced, the employment decision often seems to follow directly from that, and that they almost always go hand in hand. Partly that's because sometimes the use of force standard is based on the criminal baseline, and so there wouldn't be a difference in that many cases, though still you're talking about proof beyond a reasonable doubt versus proof by a preponderance. But if you had a heightened standard for in a statewide use of force policy, I think then you would see more differences in outcomes.
We have our law enforcement members were on the prior panel. In defense of law enforcement, I think we all know that, and especially in a county like Milwaukee with the gun violence that John described, Milwaukee police officers are encountering people with firearms hundreds, if not thousands of times in a year, and are not firing their weapon in those situations. You work on these kind of cases, it's astounding to hear law enforcement officers describe that they could have shot legally and chose not to. And then, again, anecdotally, officers will describe how the person who waved the gun would later come up and say, "Thank you, I wasn't thinking," or, because you never know their intent. So in defense of law enforcement, these cases that we're talking about, the shootings resulting in fatalities, are very, very rare. I mean, they're important, but they're rare. The second thing is, I think the public, obviously, as I said earlier, wants the police to get the benefit of the doubt. They recognize that the law enforcement officer is a dangerous job, faces critical decisions, snap decisions that are life and death, including their own or their partners or other victims that are uninvolved. And that has led to, strong political support for police officers. So it's a very strong police union. As a practical matter, is anything that we're suggesting here today going to get considered by the legislature? Kim, what do you think?
I think definitely what we're suggesting should be considered by the legislatures, of course. I mean, I think I agree. I support police, and you're right that the police involved shootings, it's usually an anomaly. It doesn't happen every day. And it's something that generally, it's bad for everyone that's involved, frankly. But I think the problem is it's not just again, I'm going to go to Joseph Mensah. It's ridiculous that he was hired by Waukesha County Sheriff's Department after he was forced to quit the Wauwatosa Police Department. That should not happen, for a man where it was determined that had significant credibility issues, even if, obviously John and I disagree with the DA's office assessment, but I respect his decision. But it was clear that there were some internal policies that were violated, and he should have been not allowed to be recertified so quickly. And in fact, I think there's some rules that were broken with that, which we're fighting against as well. But I think that's the problem. It's the credibility issues. As a lawyer, I don't want a bad lawyer to be a lawyer. I have no problem with that. If you're behaving unethically, if you are committing a crime, then I think you shouldn't be a lawyer. But from my experience, that's not what I get from from law enforcement. It's as though, well, he's a law enforcement officer, so no matter what happened, I'm going to support that. And it's almost like there's no really objectively objective way that that's being looked at by other law enforcement officers. And then you get, sort of these people running to their different sides of the fence. But ultimately, I think the perception that my clients or myself are against law enforcement is not accurate. Everyone wants the police to succeed. I think everyone recognizes the important role that police play in our society and recognize that they have a very, very hard job to do. But I also think that policing standards and people that join law enforcement offices, that those standards should significantly increase. And that if they're going to have the benefit of qualified immunity and going to have the benefit of, frankly, not being prosecuted for things that I think should be prosecuted, then we should put them at a higher standard and expect greater expectations from them, qualifications from them.
Josh, in these divided political times, is there any reasonable possibility of the legislature taking this on in a serious manner?
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. So first, let me just say it's easy to be cynical. We've all seen some of the partisan divisions we face. But it's also important to remember that these things don't happen in a linear fashion always. We sometimes see advances that come in leaps and bounds. And so John talked about the 2014 statute before, and that's a good example of that. I mean, that is a meaningful change to the way that internal investigations or that investigations into officer-involved shootings happen. And, I don't know which of the different proposals that are on the table are going to become law over time, but I think there is going to be real change. There's a bill pending right now that I think is going to pass that would prevent officer disciplinary records from being sealed when an officer goes from one agency to the next. And it's law enforcement officers, leaders who are really driving that legislation because they want to hire people. They don't want to hire people who have disciplinary problems in their past. I'll just add a couple quick things. One is I want to associate myself, Steve, with your comments from before, which is it's important that we approach this with an understanding that there are officers all around the state who are extraordinarily dedicated public servants who save lives, literally save lives around the state day after day, whether it's administering Narcan or de-escalating a challenging situation or in a number of other important ways. So it's critical that we are supporting officers and helping them to succeed. It's also critical, though, that we acknowledge some of the things that I think weren't widely acknowledged decades ago when some of these policies were being drafted, which is that implicit bias exists. And that's not specific to law enforcement. That impacts people in all walks of life, and that can lead to disparate outcomes. We are a country that has had systemic racism that has led to things like segregated housing segregation, has led to disparities in a variety of areas. And we are acting within that context. And officers are acting within that context, just as prosecutors are, just as defense attorneys are, just as civil rights lawyers are. And so we've got to approach, I think, these situations with those two things in mind, because I think that is how we can find common ground and really make progress on some of these issues.
John, what are your thoughts about the legislature taking any of this on?
So I put it in the context of what is sort of in the negative assertion is called defund the police. The positive assertion is adequately fund those entities in the community that can do a much more effective job of addressing problems like mental health and drug addiction and youthful offenders, and actually adequately fund them so that the first responders across a wide spectrum of conflict in a community aren't always the police. If it's always going to be the police responding to this huge spectrum of problems in a community, it's just statistically much more likely that they're going to get involved in incidents that require some type of use of force. So one way you can approach it is to do what we should have been doing. We're seeing the results of neglecting our public health system, for example. So what you could do is massively invest in those entities in the community. Many of them are doing this work without any compensation. Recognize that and fund them, because they're the ones that stabilize neighborhoods. They're the ones that stabilize families. And then you don't have to call the police as often. And when you do call the police, it's only going to be under really necessary circumstances. Finally, you still need really great people that want to be police officers, and that's why this attention is not directed negatively against police officers in the sense that they're bad people or anything of that nature. It's the exact opposite. Is that we all recognize that we need people of great character, great commitment to taking care of other people that are willing to do this oftentimes thankless and dangerous work. But it would make it better for them if they had so many more different options available to them instead of sort of the traditional, I came, I saw, I conquered approach. If they really had a broad array of assets, resources, connections to the community, that they didn't have to rely on just that, exert force, whether it's just arresting somebody, citing them, stopping them, or what if they were able to actually meaningfully help people get connected to other services? And that's how they were looked at, as people that connected you to resources for help. And yes, they'd still be there when things happen that are inevitably going to happen when people live in close proximity to each other. But it would take some of the expectation we have as a community, and we have to change our expectations that the police are going to solve all of our problems. You do that, and you're going to see fewer of these incidents. But it doesn't take away the need to hold everybody accountable in the process.
Before I bring Mike Gousha back on, I think I would be remiss as a former federal prosecutor for 20 years if I didn't ask your opinions on Wisconsin maybe adopting more of a parallel to the federal civil rights statute, which is a statute used for police shootings. Now, some of the same difficult issues are presented, but in terms of police misconduct, especially where it's improperly motivated, racially motivated, other aspects, it certainly seems to be a statute that provides more flexibility. You can bring in the FBI, which has less connection with local law enforcement. They have much, much less resources. I think people would be astounded to hear that there are fewer than 100 FBI agents for the entire state of Wisconsin. But in terms of being able to address, the issue of accountability that Kim Motley raised at the very beginning, I'm wondering whether, and I think all of you are familiar, Josh, obviously as a former federal prosecutor, you had access to that statute, and I know, John, you're familiar with it, and Kim, you are too. What your thoughts are of maybe, something that would prevent a inquiry into law enforcement action that's not necessarily an all or nothing, attempted murder or murder charge or self-defense and something in between. Josh, what do you think?
I think it's really important that we, in the state, pass legislation that would provide for civil rights enforcement authority. We have very limited authority along those lines right now at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. And, some of these issues that are so closely bound up with the community unrest that we see in connection with officer-involved shootings relate to issues that certainly those shootings are critical incidents and need to be treated with the utmost seriousness. But they also, I think, lead to debates about broader issues that are really important, but that we don't have a means of having an enforcement entity address in the state right now. So if there's a widespread discriminatory practice in all sorts of different contexts, whether it's housing or law enforcement or many other fields, we don't have somebody at the state who's really empowered to take systemic action. And at the federal level, unfortunately, we've seen the exercise of that authority become heavily politicized. And in the last 4 years, there was very, very limited federal civil rights enforcement. And so that left us really without that enforcement for a while. That, from my perspective, is not just bad for the specific cases, but it also undermines trust in the system as a whole, because when concerns are raised, there's nobody who can really address them directly. And that kind of authority, I think, would be vitally important in addressing some of these issues.
Let's go to John, and then Kim, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I would agree with it 100%. The audience should know that the long-standing practice, this was true when Steve was the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, this has been true with subsequent and previous U.S. attorneys, is that when there's an officer-involved shooting, we always work very closely together. We provided them all of that information. And the longstanding practice in this office is that we give the attorneys who represent the family access to everything, and that's not done commonly around the country. But our belief is that this should be as transparent as you possibly can make it. But yes, the more options that we have for accountability and transparency, and the more tools that we can provide to address the situation itself, the greater the public's going to trust us.
Kim?
And I definitely agree with what Josh and John have both said, that that we definitely need to have more tools available to the public and to be transparent with these officer-involved shootings and just be transparent. I think that it's really important, and John is right. The access that his office gives to victims that are families of victims, for people that are killed by officers is very different and is great compared to what I see in other prosecutorial offices around the country. And that helps, but I do think that definitely there needs to be, more offices that are created or that are looking at these shootings. I think it's really, really important for the public to be involved in that process, not involved, but have access to that process. And I think that will hopefully help with bringing more credibility to, or bringing a better relationship with the community and officers. And like you said, Steve, officer-involved shootings are by and large pretty rare. There's so many other microaggressive tactics that law enforcement officers impose upon different communities in Milwaukee that are really a problem, and that needs to stop. The whole way of policing, the aggressiveness in policing itself needs to stop. And, I'll end with this. I remember being a little girl. I grew up in Milwaukee, and I grew up in Berryland projects. And I remember when police officers used to give kids baseball cards. And we'd always run up to the police officers and get those baseball cards, and we loved it. We loved seeing police officers that would come into our communities when I was little. And I also remember when police stopped giving baseball cards and how that relationship significantly changed with kids and police and the community and police. And, there needs to be more of that. There needs to be more community mindedness when it comes to policing. And I think that's something that should be, taken into account when we look to moving forward and trying to create a better relationship.
Great. Thank you all. We're going to bring Mike Gousha back in, and Mike has compiled some questions from the Marquette Law students who were made aware of our program. Mike?
Okay, Steve, thank you very much. And we wanted to take a few questions from our law school students and maybe try and put them into just one or two questions. And the first question deals with something that was talked about with this panel. And the question is, how can Wisconsin prevent police officers who've shot and killed multiple individuals from being hired by other law enforcement agencies in the state? I guess the question could be, should the state of Wisconsin prevent that? But this goes, Kim Motley, to your comments about Officer Mensah, the Wauwatosa police officer, who is now going to be a law enforcement officer in a county outside Wisconsin. Should there be things that prevent that from happening?
I think there absolutely should be things that prevent that from happening. I mean, when an officer is no longer working for a law enforcement agency, he is supposed to essentially no longer be certified, with the Law Enforcement Standards Board, because you have to be hired by a law enforcement agency in order to be, for lack of a better word, certified. I think the LESB with Wisconsin, frankly, seems like more of a participation trophy, as opposed to actually having, standards by which law enforcement their licenses or their certification is being judged. I know this because particularly as it relates to Officer Mensah, I was looking and I was contacting the LESB and trying to figure out, is there a way that he can be essentially decertified? And this is when he was working for the city of Wauwatosa. and there was no way that he could be decertified. There was no sort of body within that group that deals with disciplining of officers and looks into that. And I think that really is important, that they should have more power within the LESB or take their power away because they're just a participation trophy. The fact remains is that even though this particular officer is no longer working with the city of Wauwatosa, he now is a county sheriff for Waukesha County, which is right next door. And frankly, based on the mutual aid agreements, he can still work within the city of Wauwatosa if there's if they're called to cooperate. So I absolutely think there definitely needs to be a way that we take that officers who are fired or who quit under questionable circumstances, they should not be able to be law enforcement officers in the state of Wisconsin or frankly anywhere. Steve,
anybody else want to weigh in on this one?
Well, again, we talked about the statute that gives the benefit of the doubt to the law enforcement officer, and John Chisholm and I have had this conversation many times about law enforcement. It could be that somebody is in a risky position. They're in high intensity drug trafficking cases, drug cartel cases. Could be a situation where there's a hostage situation. So I'm certainly in favor of a fact-based inquiry. I certainly didn't mean to suggest when I did the internal investigation of Officer Mensah that 3 shootings was the magic number, because there could be reasons for multiple shootings. But I certainly think that given the rarity of a police officer being involved in more than one shooting, it defies common sense to not consider that factor in future hiring.
Yeah, my brief comment on it, Mike, would be that misuse of state authority is expensive. It's expensive to the citizens, and you've seen the city, the county, pay millions and millions of dollars in civil lawsuits, and so that's something that the civilian leadership responsible for law enforcement agencies has to consider as well. What is in the best interest of our community, if nothing else from a fiscal standpoint, but it should be greater than that. It should also be, what kind of message are we sending by doing this? But as a bare minimum, you're incurring a lot of liability if you're taking on that type of history.
Another question that came up, and actually involved a case that involved the use of deadly force, not by police officers, but by civilians and a store clerk. The Corey Stingley case from 2012, which John is probably familiar with, obviously. But I think the question that was being asked here is, why do cases seem to hinge on, and I think for the public, they seem to hinge on an all or nothing choice? Why are there not lesser kinds of offenses, such as assault or misconduct in office, attached to some of these deadly force incidents, that people would feel somehow that it's not just simply yes or no? John, I'll let you begin with that.
Yeah, because unfortunately, it's no matter what crime you charge somebody with, it's a big deal, right? And the standard remains the same, that you still have to prove that with evidence that would convince the trier of fact, whether it's a jury or a judge, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so, one of our obligations is to the best of our ability, apply the law to the facts as they actually exist. And so sometimes you just don't have an adequate, for example, the difference between a felony battery charge versus a misdemeanor battery could just be the degree of the injury. But if the issue is that you still have to demonstrate intent and you can't do that, then it really doesn't make any difference if you go down or up. One of the critical elements just isn't there. And so that's very frustrating sometimes, but we look at that across the spectrum, and there are plenty of circumstances where we do go with a charge that isn't necessarily what the victim may want out of the case, or what may even seem like it measures up to the seriousness of the incident, but sometimes that's all we have. So it's really just based on the facts and what can be proven oftentimes.
And the final part of that, I guess, would be whether in some ways federal civil rights laws are almost more effective in getting justice for people who had family members die in these situations. Does anybody feel that is the case sometimes?
I definitely do think that that's the case. It not necessarily justice, but it helps to a certain extent. Of course, everyone that has a loved one that was killed will never be made whole again. But it definitely is helpful to have that as an option.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much broader authority is I think an important point to make. And we talked about this a little bit before, but in some of these cases, there's discussion not only about the critical incident itself, and that's always at the core of these issues and is vitally important, but there are also broader issues sometimes raised about the practices of a particular department. And so in Ferguson, for example, there was a lot of discussion about the practices of the police department there. Those kinds of broader systemic issues can't be addressed with state criminal law, certainly as it currently stands. Those really need civil rights enforcement authority to address.
All right. I think I'm going to wrap things up there, and I'm going to do that with a few thank yous. First of all, thanks to Steve Biskupik, our adjunct professor here at the law school, the former U.S. attorney. We appreciate you leading this last conversation. Thanks to our panelists, Attorney General Call, Attorney Motley, District Attorney Chisholm, and plus our morning participants, Milwaukee Fire and Police Commissioner Amanda Avalos, Community Collaborative Commission Chair Nate Hamilton, Milwaukee Police Chief, Acting Police Chief Jeff Norman, and the Milwaukee County Sheriff Ernell Lucas. Again, thanks to all of you for taking part today. And on behalf of Marquette University Law School and the Marquette Forum, we're glad you had a chance to tune in and watch today, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.